Good evening. This is Public Access Michiana, and we have the same guests, Bob Smith and E. Michael Jones, as we did last week. And the scripture we read last time is still relevant to what we want to discuss tonight. So let's just refresh it. We started out with Palm Sunday. Jesus was fulfilling the prophecy, and it says, "This took place to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet, saying, to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." And they laid out the palms. They were excited. The Messiah had come. The fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies was at hand. And 1 week later, everything turned around. And here's what we read. "For Pilate knew that it was out of envy that they, the religious leaders, had delivered Jesus up." And then it says, "Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." And it's assumed that a large part of that crowd was present when Jesus was fulfilling the prophecy riding on the donkey. Why did they let themselves be persuaded to change their mind about Jesus? And if we're ignorant of those forces out there trying to persuade you, if you're ignorant, my people perish for lack of knowledge. The Christians are constantly, if they're being led by the Holy Spirit, we're constantly trying to persuade people of Christ. But the enemy is also out there laying out his seed and trying to persuade people away from Christ and to release, instead of Christ, that Barabbas spirit. And Mike has even written a book on that revolutionary spirit that the other side is persuading people to go to. And the relevancy of this time is that we were analyzing a police chief coming into town, and since the last show we've had something new. We had 3 candidates. I don't think we knew that before.
No, we didn't.
And I did a little research, and we tried to do some research. It was interesting that some of it wasn't as much on the internet as
we got three different candidates. 2 of them were exactly what we feared during the last program. The one worked with the FBI and is an expert in terrorism. Has no relevance whatsoever to South Bend, Indiana. Okay, we don't have any terrorist problem here in South Bend, Indiana. The other one was of the same stripe, a guy who works for something called the Convergence Group, which is something like Blackwater.
I think it was the Emergence Group.
I'm sorry, Emergence Group.
Out of Washington, D.C.
Which is something like Blackwater, which is basically a mercenary operation that establishes police forces in conquered provinces like Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this man had experience setting up a police department in a conquered province. So if you're viewing South Bend as a conquered province, this is exactly the right guy. But I don't think that's the way most people view this. And so I think we were prophetic, in a sense, in predicting the type of person that was going to get nominated. No one knew, now we know. But there's even a more recent development, and apparently 2 of the 3 candidates have dropped out.
Yes. Recently, as last night on the news, it was reported that one of the 2 has dropped out. And then earlier this afternoon, there was a rumor that the second candidate has dropped out, which brings to question why did those 2 candidates make the list, and did the consulting firm call those 3 the top 3, or did someone from the mayor's office make the choice of making the 3 on the list the top 3? But facts have shown that all 3 aren't going to make it. One has definitely dropped out.
Or is it the 2 that I just mentioned? The black guy who was the FBI agent,
yes,
and the guy who works for the Emergence Group. So
yes,
that's good. Well, that's good
yes,
news. They were the candidates we wanted least for South Bend, Indiana.
Right, and if our show last time had some kind of influence, then they could see that we were going to, not just us, but there was a potential that people weren't going to let up.
Well, the other thing is, I think that we have to point out, we mentioned social engineering the last time. Social engineering doesn't work if you know that it's social engineering. It has to be invisible. We have to believe that it's just forces of nature that are throwing these, like the black people against the Lithuanians in Chicago. It's just a force of nature. Nobody's manipulating it. As soon as you realize someone's at the top manipulating it, then it doesn't work anymore.
Well,
so it may be simply because we've shown the light here on what I think the real game was. Maybe that ruined the whole operation. I don't know.
Well, the fellow from Washington, D.C. with the emergence group, Teachman, worked for a guy named James Kretzker or something. I can't. Krejci. Okay. Krejci is a dual citizen. He's Switzerland and the United States.
Okay.
In the 90s, he went over to Russia and helped found, the chief financial officer, helped found a major TV network system there, which now is run by one of the oligarchs, which could be like one of these Russian Jewish mafia cartel over there.
Yeah.
But this is who that Teachman works for. So the fellow that Teachman works for is got very suspicious global connections.
Well, I think these hired police forces are not in what we want here. We don't want hired mercenaries coming in and policing it. That's for conquered provinces. That's not for a people who govern themselves. So they're totally inappropriate. Whoever made the decision made a completely wrong decision, and they showed their hand about what they think about South Bend, Indiana. They think of it as a conquered province that's going to have this type of commissar who's going to come in and run it. That's not what we want.
Well, we could have easily have had it, at least in their minds.
We could have.
They certainly thought that this was...
All I'm saying is whoever made this decision had all the wrong criteria, and that became apparent when they showed their hand and they showed the three candidates. Totally inappropriate for our situation.
And they were expecting nobody to notice.
Right. I think that was the conventional accounts. None of this came out in the conventional accounts. So it just shows you that there's a big vacuum here in terms of news and the transmission of news, and more importantly, the analysis of the news, which just doesn't happen here.
And there's a vacuum of enough men that have dedicated themselves, which every Christian should be dedicated, to analyzing things that need to be analyzed.
Right.
I mean, if you were a pastor in a church and you went on leave for a while and you said, well, I'm going to have somebody else preaching, and he's preaching heresy, well, wouldn't you be, why did you let that happen?
Right, and also back to your scripture there, people will try to negatively influence other people just for their own envy or their personal gain. And in this case, as has been shown through history, sooner or later the truth is going to come out. But the problem is there has always got to be someone or some group there that is willing to question the decisions such that people can start thinking, and this type of selection process, it was faulty, and the candidates who were on the list were not what's needed as policemen for a city that is self-governed in a country that is self-governed. We are not at war.
Or conquered.
Right. So the reduction in the list is a good thing.
Right, and so the other fella is more acceptable. I mean, he
was the least objectionable, let's put it that way. I don't know whether he gets it by default. Do you get it by default if the other two guys or just the whole process? Is the whole process going to be called into question if two people leave before the selection takes place?
There's really no choice. You don't have a choice.
It was very little choice to begin with. 3 candidates, all picked by this guy from Wasserman, from Martha's Vineyard. No local candidates, even though there was great public expression of or desire for a local candidate. So I think the whole process is faulty, and I think they should start all over again, rather than just give it to a guy by default simply because the other 2 guys left. That doesn't really.
But it's
not much of a mandate, it seems to me.
Right.
It's partly in the hands of Wasserman, or I mean,
it's totally in the hands of Buttigieg at this point.
But who was Wasserman?
Wasserman has total control over who the candidates are, and that's 99% of the game. So basically, it's like a political election where you have to choose between a Democrat and a Republican, and the Democrats and the Republicans generally get together and they agree that there are certain issues we are not going to address. So the one in recent memory was Clinton and Bush over NAFTA and GATT. The 2 parties were conspiring together to keep that out. No one was allowed to talk about that. It has had a horrendous effect on American manufacturing. We've lost hundreds of thousands of jobs because of it. And both parties agreed not to talk about it in the election. It was just imposed after the fact. This is sort of the way things happen here. You know, where you agree, the man who makes the choices behind the scenes, that you have to vote for either John Kerry or George Bush, both of whom happen to belong to the same secret society at Yale. You know, so what choice is that? You know what I mean? This is the whole point of the narrowing of options, is 99% of the game. But now it's Buttigieg's choice whether he's going to go with this flawed program or whether he's going to revise it.
Well, Wasserman, I did a little bit of research for the show, but I should have already known it, but he was like one of the main advisors for Homeland Security.
Of course he is. This is the whole point. You're going to be tied into Homeland Security. Well, who wants that?
Well, their connections are also not that.
This is, first of all, it's a bogus operation. You know, it's a bogus operation to terrorize people and humiliate them at airports.
And there's a lot of dual citizen of Israel.
Michael Chertoff is apparently former head of it. He's apparently the guy who owns the company that makes all these machines that x-ray you when you're going through the thing. So there's conflict of interest. It's a mess. We don't need that. We got problems of our own. Let's talk about the problems we have here. We got control problems here, right? Tell us about the control problems, especially relevant now to the school situation.
Right. Currently, we have problems with security in our schools. Recently, we've had the shootings in Newtown there, and then
in Connecticut.
Now we have problems in the schools. You know, there are the security guards at the high schools. Recently, at one of the local high schools, the guard took off to attend a meeting. While he was at the meeting, the principal and the assistant principal at the school were attacked, and the attacks were severe. They needed medical care.
Attacked by students.
Right, attacked by students.
They were in school that day, or they just snuck in, or
no, they were in school that day. They simply left their class and attacked the principal and the assistant.
Was it premeditated, or did the principal do something to provoke them? I mean, what was? We don't know.
We don't know. You know. This morning in the paper, we had a security guard that was fired just for having an altercation with a student. So the purpose of the security guard there is to protect the faculty and the student. If the security guard happens to have an altercation, that's part of his job, just to protect the faculty and the students. In the case of the first high school I mentioned, that security guard was absent, and the principal and the assistant principal paid the price. They were attacked, you know. Now, if the guard were there, he would have had the altercation with the 3 students who attacked the teachers there, and it probably could have been stopped. So, such that our school system has to have a clear, definitive process of why the security guards are there.
So you're saying there's conflicting signals here.
Yes.
On the one hand, the guy gets reprimanded, or you say fired for doing his job.
For doing his job.
And then the other hand, where the man is not there to do the job, the principal gets beaten up by the students.
Yes.
Well, this is total chaos. This is total chaos. I mean, I remember, I'm not that old, but I remember a time when you didn't have armed guards in schools.
Never, I mean, like I was saying before, I worked at Adams, and they fired me for passing out a Jesus newspaper. A lot of people in town know it. And right after I got fired, the students are like, Peter, you can't believe all the squad cars, they're having all this trouble in the school. Well, one thing leads to another. I mean,
Well, speaking of Adams, the man that's named after, John Adams, wrote once, he said, "We have no constitution that functions in the absence of a moral people."
right, in
And he
Indiana,
says that passions, if they're not kept in control, will sweep through this like a whale through a thin net.
right, in Article 8 of the Indiana Constitution, which the students are supposed to know thoroughly because the mandatory curriculum is heavy on the Indiana Constitution. But Article 8 says that the reason kids go to school, or the purpose of the school, fundamentally is, number one, to encourage by all suitable means moral improvement. Well, so the people ought to be asking, well, what are you guys using?
Well, that's completely consistent with what John Adams said. And he also said that the less moral control you have in a society, the more physical control you have to put to replace the absent moral control. And so what have we seen over the course of our lives here? The moral control evaporating or being undermined by all of the pernicious forces in our society, like Hollywood, for example. We've all talked about this before. So this moral force evaporates, and as it evaporates, you need physical force to replace it, because you have to have order. You cannot have a society without order. If there's not internal order, then it's got to be externally imposed order. And I think that's what we're seeing here across the board. We're seeing the failure of all of these institutions to create that moral character that is the absolute bedrock basis for any democratic society. If you can't rule yourself, then you can't have self-rule.
Well, also, in the schools, you have the violence problem now, but you also have drugs being used to control kids. Kids are being labeled either by the school or the medical profession as needing some type of drugs to control their behavior. And it's been shown recently there that these drugs have a long time effect on kids. Now, has anyone found out that maybe these drugs are helping to encourage some violence in
Well, I
school,
mean, first of all, you've got a failure, once again, of self-control. Okay, so what do you do when you have the failure of self-control? Do you reinforce? No. What you do is you come to some type of chemical means for control. And Ritalin is the classic example that gets handed out in all the schools, and this becomes kind of the gateway drug for what are now known as serotonin receptor inhibitors. And that would be Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil, which were created for adults, and now they're being used on children. So, to get back to the massacre in Connecticut, you don't know anything. You got 24-hour news, and it's all contradicting each other, and 99% of it is focusing on teddy bears and candles. And the one question they have to ask immediately, we have to ask immediately, and we need an answer immediately, is, was this guy given drugs?
Right.
Was he under psychiatric care, and what drugs was he prescribed? Was it Paxil? Was it Zoloft? Was it Prozac? Because you can go and you can see that there are websites and studies where you can list one school incident after another, and I think you can correlate it pretty directly with the drugs that have been prescribed. Because these drugs are dangerous. They have a very powerful effect on the mind, and the effect is very clear. It leads, suicide is one of the side effects of these drugs. And a suicide is violence against yourself. And a lot of times in situations like this, they exert violence against other people and then they kill themselves.
Right, so it's a suicidal thing, and then and then it includes.
Right, so I think that, so again, once again, the theme here is control. If you don't have moral control in your life, you're going to have external control. And the external control may be security guards at the school, or maybe it's chemical controls. And the trouble with these things is that they have side effects. And what we're realizing now is that the side effects of these drugs far outweigh any possible benefit that anyone can see from these things.
Well, can we boil it down? I mean, the drugs are a replacement for, can you almost say, the father? In other words, if the father was a real father in the home like Abraham, will there be control? Right? That's what his job is.
Well, first of all, you have a culture that denigrates any kind of authority. Certainly male authority, certainly the quintessential male authority is fatherhood. Denigrates that. Look at any sitcom, and the father is the biggest idiot on the show. Okay? And the only people that can apparently get any respect are homosexuals now, and they are by definition not fathers. Okay? So it's this attack on fatherhood, it's an attack on authority, and so on and so forth. And so the child is raised in a kind of vacuum where he's aggressive, but he's aggressive in a world where he's getting hurt because of the lack of fatherly protection. And one of the ways you get hurt is by going to a psychiatrist and getting these drugs prescribed to you. You need a father to step in and say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to deal with it the real way, which is basically you got to control yourself. You have these passions. But the point here is that we have industries that are based on the arousal of passion. The pornography industry is based on the illicit arousal of passion. Gambling is a passion, the passion of greed. And now, another instance here that in these school killings, the next question you asked after the drug question is the video game question. And apparently, from what I've read, the guy was, he was a troubled youth. If you're a troubled youth, you are taking drugs. You have had drugs prescribed to you. That's 99% certitude of that. And he's troubled, so what does he do? He sits down in the basement and he plays video games all day. Well, guess what video game he was playing? It's Call of Duty, which is basically where you go out and you kill people. So you add that, there's another layer, okay? And then you add the fact that his father left. They're divorced. And the mother is taking up with the gardener, evidently. I guess she read Lady Chatterley's Lover or something like that. But, and then on top of that, another layer, she's a gun collector. And not only that, in order to make up for the vacuum of the absent father, let's take the kid out to the shooting range and teach him how to shoot guns. Well, you put all these things together, is it surprising?
It's just a walking time bomb.
It's like a binary weapon. You put this and this together, it's going to go off and it's going to explode. And I think that's why we're seeing so much of this.
Well, I think a observed article on the internet was that some lady wrote an article saying, I am the mother of this child or something. In other words, there's a lot of mothers.
Right.
A lot of situations. I mean, every teacher will tell you that I know most of the problems in his classroom come from because the children are single mothers, single parent home.
Right.
Especially mothers. So you have a classic case here.
This looks like a classic case of it. The father abandons. He checks out. They got plenty of money. Money's not a problem. She's just going to live there, won't have to work another day for the rest of her life. She gets this boyfriend. Obviously, the kid is troubled. He's troubled. He's troubled by all of these things. And the drugs exacerbate everything that is troubling him.
And he yields to the...
it seems to me that there must be some type of... Now, I've never taken a drug like this. I have no idea what the effect is. But I imagine there is this sense of pain, and it builds, a sense of rage starts building, and you need some type of release. You can't get any release discharging this emotion, and so you find it in shooting guns. So you find it vicariously in these video games, which are very realistic, and apparently the military uses them.
Yes, they do.
This is the best training for soldiers, to be able to go out there and shoot a guy down without a moment's hesitation.
Well, yeah, they say that's the biggest problem, is that a lot of guys...
It was always the problem that the soldiers would not fire their guns. And so this trains you like a rat in a maze to fire that gun. And at a certain point, maybe it's like pornography. Maybe the thrill wears off, and you got to try it out in the real world. So it's like the analogy to pornography. You see it so much, you got to go out and rape someone, because rape and pornography go hand in hand. So this is, you see the killing so much, it's starting to wear off. You've got this agony going in your mind, in your brain, because your brain has been taken over by this drug, and you need some type of release, so you find it killing people.
Well, what's the difference between these students attacking a principal? I mean, in your day, somebody attacking the principal is like...
Well, during our day, and I know during my day, that was never heard of, never done. If it was attempted, it was stopped right there. Children are under stress. Children have to release that energy they have. And also, as we all have said, if there is a lack of moral control there, somehow the society, meaning school, the police, or someone, they will try to induce some type of control, either through the police or through some drugs. That's what's being done now in school. Most school kids who have problems, they are prescribed drugs.
I had a thought that I thought was relevant. Jesus said, if you curse your parents, you shall die the death. That's almost probably the most powerful statement that would shock any culture, that Jesus is saying the punishment for cursing or speaking evil of your parents is that person should be put to death. Now, we don't do that, and I'm sure there's ways to interpret that not so harshly, but if kids are used to doing that, if you have a culture where kids show disrespect for parents, if we could take him literally, then going into a kindergarten class and shooting them may very well parallel cursing your parents out. Mm-hmm. It may be the same depth of evil. So we don't think it's evil. We have children that are disrespecting their parents to the point of cursing them out.
Right.
And we overlook it. Well, moving from there and shooting up some kindergarten kids, we think that's a huge leap. May not be so.
Well, I think what you see here is the foundation is laid by the culture. You have lots of disturbed people. You've got television ads, newspaper ads, Sunday supplement ads. If you feel at all at odds, this is the drug that's going to solve your problem, just go to your doctor and tell them to prescribe it. So they do that, and we have millions and millions of dosages of things like Zoloft and Prozac by people who have been troubled by the culture. Now, once it gets to that point, it's worse. It's worse than it was. And so at that point, it's going to find some type of outlet. So if it's just you're stuck in your car and you're stuck in traffic, it's called road rage. If you have a gun available and you kill somebody, it's called murder. If you murder a bunch of people, it's a massacre. Apparently, there's a whole category of female teachers who sleep with their male students. This is also a category, and you can link that with the Prozac and all these other drugs.
We're going to have just a half an hour show here, so we're going to have to. We only have like 30 seconds left. So obviously, there's a lot that we could touch upon.
Yes, there is.
There are connectings to the police chief, to the Connecticut shooting.
But the idea is control. If there's no moral control, it's got to be physical control. And physical control cannot replace moral control.
And yet physical control is precisely what the fathers are told they can't do in the home.
That's right. So that's the whole thing in a nutshell.
Yeah.
So we're going to close up, and hopefully you'll be able to see this show very shortly.